There are two accounts in the Bible that I'd like to discuss briefly. One of them is my favorite Old Testament account, and that is Elijah on Mount Carmel. Also, I would like to talk a little bit about Jesus healing the man born blind in John chapter 9, and then let's see where we go with that. Here's John McNary telling us the account of Elijah on Mount Carmel.
So the people of Israel are waffling back and forth between God and this false god named Baal. And so God sends Elijah to draw the people back to himself. So Elijah goes to King Ahab and he says, King Ahab, we need to settle this once and for all. He says, there are 450 prophets of Baal. Why don't you gather all 450 of the prophets of Baal? And why don't you invite all the people of the kingdom of Israel to meet us, to join us on Mount Carmel, and let's have a showdown. I'm like the only prophet of God left, and so you get the 450 prophets of Baal. You tell all the people there's going to be a showdown. They don't want to miss this, and I'll meet you there, and we'll have a test, and we'll see who the real God is. And Ahab says, I think that sounds fun. Let's do it. So he gathers the 450 prophets of Baal, and he calls on the people of the northern kingdom of Israel to come watch this epic showdown between 450 prophets of Baal and one prophet of God. And so when they get there, Elijah says, all right, let's do this. Let's take two bulls, and prophets of Baal, you can choose whichever bull you want. I'll take the one that gets left behind, but you take the better bull. And let's both build an altar, and let's both cut up our bull and sacrifice it on the altar. Let's put wood on the sacrifice, but let's stop short of lighting the sacrifice on fire. Let's call on the name of our God, and the God who is alive, and the God who is real, and the God who has power and authority will light the fire from heaven. Well, the prophets of Baal think this sounds like a good idea, so they go first. They take the better bull, they build their altar, they cut up the bull, they put it on the wood, and they start to pray, light the fire, Baal, light the fire. This goes on all morning with them singing and dancing and praying to Baal that he would light the fire, but nothing happens. So Elijah, which this is so cool, Elijah starts to taunt them. We read in 1 Kings 18, at noon, Elijah began to taunt them. Shout louder, he said. Surely he's a god. Perhaps he's deep in thought or busy or traveling. You know, maybe he's sleeping and needs to be awakened. Like he went to the beach to escape the snow, right? Like, what? Do gods travel? You know, he's at the Gulf. Okay, well, wake him up, bring him back. I don't know. This goes on all day. The sacrifice never is burned up. Of course not. And all the people see this. All the people see what happened. So then Elijah says, okay, it's my turn. And he builds an altar to God, and he cuts up his bull, and he lays it on the wood on top of the altar, but then he goes one step further, and he starts to dig this trench out around the altar. He digs this trench around the altar, and then we read that he says, fill 4 large jars with water and pour it on the offering and on the wood. Do it again, he said, and they did it again. They did it a second time. Do it a third time, he ordered, and they did it the third time. The water ran down around the altar and even filled the trench. So Elijah then does this. He gets 12 jars of water poured over the sacrifice, and then he prays, and he says, God, to the one who is alive, he says, God, would you send fire and ignite this sacrifice? And would you draw the people back to yourself, that they would see who the real God is and that they would worship you alone? And then we read, verse 38, then the fire of the Lord fell and burned up the sacrifice, the wood, the stones, and the soil, and also licked up all the water in the trench. The people who have come to watch this showdown, they are so floored by this miracle of God. They literally fall prostrate, and they just start declaring, the Lord, He is God. The Lord, He is God. if there was any question in their mind where their worship should be directed, there is no question now. It is obvious who deserves to be worshiped. They gather up the 450 prophets of Baal and they slaughter every one of them. They say, we are not going to waffle between good and evil, between God and Baal any longer. It's over. And their hearts are drawn back to God. Well, as you can imagine, this doesn't sit real well with old Jezebel. And so Jezebel goes to Elijah and she says, may the gods deal with me, be it ever so severely, if by this time tomorrow I do not make your life like that of one of them.
John goes one direction, and I'd like to just take it a slightly different direction. There are the Israelites who witnessed this event on Mount Carmel, and they turned from worshiping idols to worshiping the true God. But consider Jezebel. She saw the evidence, the undeniable evidence of the reality of God. But out of her own selfishness, her own self-centeredness, her own desire for personal power, she denied it. She denied it by choice, not by reason, and threatened to destroy the prophet of that one true God. The position Jezebel took was not logical. It was not out of intelligence. It was not out of evidence. It was out of self-centeredness solely. Now let's look at the New Testament account in John chapter 9 of Jesus healing the man born blind. First of all, the man was blind. There is no way that somebody is going to fake blindness from birth to adulthood. He wouldn't do it. He can't do it. It would be very easy to verify that this man is blind. And after he was healed, it's very easy to verify that now he could see. That healing was indisputable from any of the scribes and Pharisees who witnessed it. And what was the scribes and Pharisees' response to that? They pretty much ignored the event. Their only concern was to try to pin something damaging on Jesus, the one who had performed the miracle. They brought the man who was healed in for questioning, and I love the account. The man who was healed maybe was blind, but he was not stupid. Read it. It's great. My point is, people who reject the truth of the living God, the reality of our Creator, those who reject that, reject it by choice, not by lack of evidence. I see on here, prove that God exists. The difficulty isn't in finding evidence to accept Him. The difficulty is actually in closing your eyes and ears to all the evidence so that you can reject Him. I'm sorry, that's how I see it. Not sorry, really. It's just the way it is.